Nobody goes around beheading babies. Nobody. There it was in the Murdoch press, Hamas beheading babies. Even after CNN had walked back its claim and its story, even after the Israeli government dropped it, failed to provide evidence, even after the claims had been debunked, the News Corporation in Australia has refused to walk back its propaganda, and mud sticks. Indeed, on Monday night, the ABC's Q&A was still repeating the claims, voiced by coalition spruiker James McGrath.
People at a dance festival being herded together and massacred like the Nazis did to the Jewish people during World War II. We saw the beheading of babies. So the line has been crossed by Hamas, and we must stand with Israel as they take the fight to Hamas.
Do you think Israel should show restraint?
Not when it comes to hunting down those animal savages that are Hamas.
What if innocent people have been killed here?
What about the 260 people at the dance festival who were murdered? What about the babies who had their heads beheaded? This is what we're dealing with.
This war propaganda is self-defeating. It only undermines the atrocities happening in Israel, the slaughter of innocent civilians by Hamas, which sparked this war. Hysterical war propaganda, as espoused by the Murdoch media, will only lead to more hatred, more deaths on both sides. You have to ask, is this what the Murdoch press really wants? I think we know what the answer is. It's little known in the public domain, but once a journalist gets into a management position at one of the newspapers in the Australian media, they're shuffled off on a junket to Israel. We personally know many editors and editors-in-chief who have been chaperoned by the Israel lobby on these junkets. No other government lobby does it as far as we know, and it explains in part the immense power of the Israel lobby over the mainstream media in Australia. Top journalists working as Middle East correspondents come under constant, intense pressure for their reporting, as do their editors back home. Correspondents such as John Lyons, Martin Chulov, Sophie O'Neill, to name a handful. Lyons has even written a book about it. The PR pressure is documented but rarely covered or understood. This is perhaps the most powerful lobby in Australia. The business lobby that we always go on about is extremely powerful and has the newspapers under its thumb, but the Israel lobby is extremely active, and all this affects the media coverage in this country. And the politicians too. Their insipid response to this crisis is a similar situation. They too are invited on junkets to Israel. It works like this. The pressure to self-censor is so great that the media is afraid to represent the facts in a fair way. Palestine war crimes are illuminated and Israeli war crimes are downplayed, both in presentation and in the actual wording of the stories, in the photographs, in the captions. Why? Because no journalist or publication wants to be labelled as terrorist sympathisers. The common tactic is to conflate any coverage critical of the Israeli government and the IDF, the Israel Defence Force, with anti-Semitism. They conflate the two. The claims of anti-Semitism indeed are flowing thick and fast at the moment, spilling from the mainstream media into social media. And so it is, and this is a tremendous irony, that the Jewish press in Israel reports more fairly on the conflicts in the Middle East than do media outlets in Australia and in other countries. The newspaper Haaretz is a prime example. The good journalists in the mainstream media here do their jobs. Norman Hermont at the ABC has been doing a terrific job covering the crisis even-handedly, as per the 7:30 reports this week. The problem is not with the reporters. It is with insipid management. And it does nothing to help the good people of Israel, who will only suffer from more bloodshed and reprisals if hysterical media coverage persists. Of course, Israel needs to respond to the Hamas attacks. The question is proportionality. What do they do? How many people will die? And another question for Israel is, in this new media environment, if the war lobby overcooks its propaganda, how much will that defeat its own cause? How much will that increase the conflict and lead to greater human suffering? These graphics tell part of the story, the root cause, what it's all about. This is the Palestinian deaths versus Israeli deaths in conflicts over the years its UN data. This second chart maps the incursion of Israeli settlements in Gaza and the West Bank. Without excusing in any way the recent barbarities, these things are what got us here. Breaches of international law on both sides. The problem, too, is that our politicians are also under pressure. The failure of Anthony Albanese and Penny Wong to be even-handed and sensible in their response to this crisis is simple to explain. They fear reprisals in the Murdoch media and on commercial television and radio talkback. We can see it in the attack on the Teals this week. Front page treatment, the splash in the Australian newspaper. A personal attack on two of the Teals, who, of course, are the archenemy now of the coalition because they've stolen their seats. To quote, Teal duo in moral fog over attacks on Israel. The point of this, of course, is political, to buttress the coalition by attacking the Teals, which have stolen their seats in Parliament. And the narrative overall is that our politicians and media who don't support the government of Benjamin Netanyahu and its present response and what it's going to do will be branded anti-Semitic and terrorist sympathisers. Now, Peter Dutton, the opposition leader, knows this well. He will get the hero treatment in the Murdoch press for being as warmongering as he possibly can.
The opposition leader, Peter Dutton, is calling for people who attend pro-Palestinian protests in Sydney to be deported.
If there were people there who are on visas, they should be identified and they should have their visas cancelled. They should be deported.
Show no restraint. It's a winning formula for Dutton. Fear and misinformation, branding his adversaries as weak on terror, as weak on national security. But the world has changed. The mainstream media is paywalled and rapidly diminishing in credibility. And although, yes, commercial TV and radio follows their narrative still, people under 40 are more sophisticated as consumers of media. They don't trust the mainstream. They don't trust the fossil media. So the hysterical propaganda is backfiring and will continue to backfire and create more human suffering. It has a deleterious effect. Consumers trust these days who they think they should trust. People, not organisations, individuals on social media and independent media. The distrust of the fossil media runs deeper. It's seeping into distrust for all large institutions allied with government. Back before the days of the first Gulf War, the first war against Saddam Hussein, in order to win public support to invade Kuwait and to go after Saddam Hussein, the US government hired a public relations company, Hill and Knowlton, to come up with a narrative. And so they did. They came up with the Iraqi troops murder Kuwaitis in incubators narrative. Again, who murders babies en masse? Nobody. That's who. For the subsequent war, the Second Gulf War, the invasion of Iraq, the war lobby invented the Saddam Hussein people shredder story, that the Iraqi dictator was literally shredding human beings in some great big metal machine. And John Howard, the then Prime Minister, ran it in Parliament, also repeated the narrative. The Murdoch press, of course, front-paged it, nothing better than a human shredder, to sell newspapers and to get a war going. Well, they got their war going. The weapons of mass destruction narrative, of course, turned out to be a monstrous porky too, but they got their war going, and that war generated ISIS. It was a total disaster which cost 1 million people their lives. And the Murdoch press, without one single reprisal, was arguably the number one perpetrator in this war by creating consent for the war. The mob most responsible for the subsequent terror attacks and the loss of human life. This isn't just about propaganda. It's about immense human suffering due to dishonest media. And here we are again. They talked up a war against China, the Murdoch press, and Nine Media for that point too. But that's not happening yet. And so Israel it is. Warmongering at the cost of Israeli and Palestinian lives. Nary a call for restraint, nary a call to uphold international law, which condemns starving entire populations and depriving them of water and medical supplies. It condemns driving 1 million people from their homes. If any more evidence of complete moral failure were required, we can look to Yemen. The conflict in Yemen, the civil war, 150,000 people killed and maybe another 230,000 dead as a result of the humanitarian crisis in that country. And here we are, Australia, supplying Saudi Arabia with billions of dollars worth of weapons to attack Yemen and keep that war going. Most Australians would not even know about it, but you can be sure that most Australians have heard of Hamas beheading babies, thanks to the war profiteers.